Hi, I'm Jamie Cowan, Rabbi of Tikvat Israel Messianic Jewish Congregation in Richmond, Virginia, and formerly the president of the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations. I'm going to be teaching this course multiple hours on Jewish history and culture. This is a course that I've actually taught in the Messianic Jewish Bible Institute classes all over the world. I've been in the Ukraine and Odessa, Brazil, Argentina, Hungary, and so I want to welcome you to the course here on camera. It's going to be fun, and I hope we'll have a good time. And it's a lot of information, and we'll try to make it as easy to understand as possible. So I want to begin from the beginning, and I want to talk first about the concept of history. Because what we have to understand in anytime history is taught, it is the whole class, the whole orientation is really guided by the worldview of the historian. There really is no such thing as an objective history. It's impossible, because anytime you talk about history, you're having to choose, the historian is having to choose which events he or she is going to include in the class, and consequently, what ends up happening is that the historian chooses what they feel is valuable and what they feel is not valuable. And so it ultimately is how they perceive the world. In other words, what is important to them, what is important in their values, and what they consider to be crucial in historical periods. And so, as an example, many of you, certainly those of you who are viewing this from the former Soviet Union, used to be under the communist system, and so history was taught in that system with a certain orientation called dialectical materialism, and as a result, everything was looked at through economic change, the dialectics of various cultures clashing with one another, and the whole aspect of religion was completely downplayed. Any idea that God has any role in history whatsoever is absolutely absent from the course. And so history was understood from an extremely secular, economic, non-religious orientation. So that was one experience. In the Western world, those of us from the Western world, different but also similar, because we were taught generally from a secular, humanistic orientation. Again, certainly in the Western world, the idea of religion is diminished. I mean, certainly when you cover certain religious periods of world history, like the Reformation, the rise of the church, so on, obviously those things have to be covered. But the idea that there's any reality to this, that there's any that God himself is involved in human history at any level, is completely dismissed, and rather it's perceived or it's covered from more of an academic orientation of this is what the people believed, but there's really no idea that God really causes anything in human history. But when you look at the Bible, you really see something completely different. When you look at the scriptures, you see that God himself is very much involved in human history, from the very beginning of the creation all the way to the end of time, with the return of the Messiah and the establishment of God's kingdom on the earth. And what you see is God moving among the nations to bring about his certain purposes. Well, that's how I like to look at the history of the Jewish people. Because the Jewish people were called of God, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. They have a special covenant with God. They have a special relationship with God in their chosenness and so forth. And God uses them throughout human history to accomplish his purposes. As a result, the involvement of the Lord in human affairs becomes critical. And so we'll see it certainly in the scriptures. Those of you that know the Bible well can see certainly God's involvement, like for instance the opening of the Red Sea, or the life of Yeshua, Jesus the Messiah, or his resurrection. You see all these involvements, but what ends up happening is, of course, the scriptures end at the end of the first century of the Common Era. And so then the question is, well, is God even involved in human history beyond the Bible? Well, of course, we know that is the case. But then how do we determine, though, where God is involved and where he is not? That's what gets a little bit tricky. And so what we're going to be doing in this course is, certainly as we cover the first parts of Jewish history, it's a lot clearer where God's involved, because we're going to be referring a lot to the Bible. And so the Bible describes God's involvement in Jewish history and human history. But also, when we get beyond that, when we get beyond the New Testament period, what we're going to be looking at is I'll be making essentially kind of projections, I should say, about maybe what God was trying to do in the world through the Jewish people. It's interesting because we'll see when we look at the life of Abraham that God had called the Jewish people to ultimately bless all the nations, and that he who curses them will be cursed and he who blesses them will be blessed. So what happens is as the Jews disperse to all the nations, particularly after the first and second exiles, what you end up looking at is not only Jewish history and the history of the Jewish people, but the history of most of the nations of the world, because Jews are involved in the nations, and so you see God's involvement with them in the nations, and so you end up looking at not only Jewish history, but world history as well. And so we're going to be examining how God himself is involved throughout all of human history, even up to the present day. Let me give you an example to try to make this somewhat understandable in our modern era. For instance, we all remember the first Gulf War starting in 1990 and then 91. And of course, if you remember, the war began because Iraq decided to attack Kuwait and seize the oil wells in Kuwait. And then, of course, the United States got involved because they didn't want all the oil of the Middle East to come under Iraqi rule. And so the war plays on. But the question is God involved in it at all? Does he really care? What is his will? And so forth. Well, I think what happens is you see an example of God's involvement in the following way. If you remember during the war, Israel was attacked. Saddam Hussein launched missiles into Israel. And Israel wanted to respond but didn't because the United States was pressuring them not to respond. And so what ends up happening is we all know the Allies bring this massive war machine over to Iraq, and the Iraqis are pushed back out of Kuwait and so forth. But what about Kuwait? In other words, here's poor Kuwait. They get wiped out. And Kuwait kind of is an innocent party in this until you look a little bit behind the scenes. And what you discover is that Kuwait was the primary funder of the Palestine Liberation Organization. They'd been channeling millions and millions of dollars into this essentially terrorist organization to destroy the Israelis. And so what I believe happened was that God was using Saddam Hussein as his tool to attack Kuwait to prevent the monies from being transferred over to the Palestine Liberation Organization. And because Kuwait was so wiped out, their funding dried up and actually pushed the PLO towards peace with Israel. But then what happens, and this is another example of what happens in the Bible all the time, is Saddam Hussein then goes beyond what God intends, attacks Israel, and as a result, God then uses forces to attack him, because the scriptures say, he who blesses my people will be blessed, and he who curses them will be cursed. And so this is just kind of a modern example of maybe how God himself is involved in human history. And this is what we're going to be looking at in this course, is we're going to go through each piece and try to examine where was God in the midst of this, especially when you look at some of the tragedies that the Jewish people have gone through throughout history, especially following the destruction of the Second Temple. And we'll look at that in great detail. And you have to ask yourself sometimes, where was God? Certainly many Jewish people have asked that question after coming through the Holocaust and the terrible tragedies that occurred. Many of them came out, those that survived, came out being atheists because they said, how could God allow such a thing? And we're going to examine that as well. Where was God during the Holocaust? Huge question, even in our modern generation. So these are the kinds of things that we'll be covering in this course as we move through. So I want to begin with this idea here of the Jewish people specifically. The Jews are what we call two unique types of people. Number one, they are one of the people groups of the world. For instance, we know that there's ethnic groups throughout all of the world. There's the French, the Chinese, the various African nations, and so on. And every specific people group has a culture that's attached to it. That's been influenced by their environment, by their experiences, by their history, and so on. And that's also true of the Jews. The Jewish people, because they were spread to all the nations, Jewish people groups in various nations have unique and different experiences, and as a result, their culture has been influenced by their experiences. So, for instance, many of us are familiar with klezmer music, which is the kind of the Eastern European sound of music, the oompa sound, which actually led in the American continent to to the development of swing music. Really came somewhat out of the klezmer experience. Well, where did klezmer come from? Where did that musical experience came from? It came as Jews were being forced out of one country, out of another. And so you get sounds, you get in the klezmer music sound, you get Spanish sounds, Arabic sounds, Eastern European sounds. You get all these various kinds of sounds that become reflective of the Jewish experience. And so that's one example of Jewish culture and experience. Another one is, certainly in the American scene, is the eating of gefilte fish or chicken soup and matzo balls, or known as knedlach. These are connected to culture. And a lot of times this culture is, how should we say, it's kind of reflective of the Jewish people. And when people think of Jews, this is what they think of. But it really has nothing to do with God. In other words, it's simply their experiences as they've come throughout world history, like any other people group's experience might be. It doesn't mean it's not of God, but it simply means it's part of their cultural heritage and experiences. On the other hand, you do have something unique with respect to the Jewish people because they have a special covenant with God. God called them from the very beginning and gave them a covenant built around the Torah, the laws of Moses, that has influenced their lives to this day. So, for instance, what you see is in their experiences is the insistence or the practice of keeping the Sabbath day. When the Sabbath, the Shabbat on Saturday, was introduced by the law of Moses around 1400 BCE, there was no concept of the week in the world. In other words, the idea of a week has no astronomical significance at all. Nothing happens over a period of a week. I mean, you have a month, you have years, but a week, nothing happens. The sun and the moon are not shifting around in any unique way. But what God said was he wanted one day out of 7 to be designated as a day of rest. And so as a result, Jewish people have set aside historically this unique day where they take a break, they rest, they study the scriptures, they worship God, they do all these various kinds of things. And this has influenced their lifestyle even to this very day. In fact, if you go to Israel today, even though most of Israel is secular, if you go to Israel today on Saturday, everything is almost completely shut down. I mean, most restaurants are not open. You see very few cars on the road. Even though most people are not in synagogues on the Sabbath in Israel, because most are not religious, they're still not working and they're still not involved in commerce like in malls and stores because of the influence of the laws of Moses. And so much of Jewish experience has to do with kind of walking out this covenant that God has with his people. Much of what we would look at when you look at Jewish people in the Orthodox community and the wearing of the kippah, which I have on my head today, or the wearing of the black coats, like in ultra-Orthodox parts of the community. This all has to do with how they understand the covenant that God has with them. And so what we're going to be doing as we go through this course is to try to distinguish between what is purely cultural, in other words, simply because they're a people group like any other people group of the world, and also what is uniquely something that God himself has called the Jewish people to do, which is different than the other nations, because God has called the Jewish people to be unique among all the nations of the earth. Now, I really want to begin this course as we start this with what I call the 10 questions. And we're all familiar with the 10 commandments, but this is different. This is known as the 10 questions. And what these questions have to do with is, why are Jewish people a certain way? Why do they act a certain way? Why do they have certain kinds of characteristics or certain types of behavior that is sometimes different from the rest of the community? Now, these questions are stereotypical. I'll say it right off the bat. It doesn't mean that every Jews are this way, but the vast majority will clearly kind of reflect at least some or all of these following types of characteristics. So let's begin. Number one, the first question is this, is why are so many Jews highly educated? Or, in other words, why is education so important to the Jewish people? That's number one. Number two is, why do Jews tend to be successful in business? Again, not all are, including myself, but many are. Many major businesses. In fact, most of the clothing manufacturers of the United States are all run by Jews. Most of the movie industry are run by Jews. You know, why is that the case? We will be examining that. Number three, why do Jews tend to be good with money? Okay, why do Jews tend to be good with money? Number 4 is, why are they viewed as sometimes being stingy or non-generous? Now, this is not true, but the perception is from outside the Jewish people is that they are perceived as being a stingy, non-generous people. So we'll look at that question. Number 5, why are Jews often tough negotiators? In fact, I remember shortly after I came to Richmond, Virginia, I'm originally from Washington, D.C., I was meeting with a Christian pastor at one point, and we were talking about something, and then he said, yeah, well, this person Jewed me down. And this is a fairly common phrase. Jew me. Now, it's anti-Semitic, and I know he didn't mean it that way, but that was just a common thing. And what did he mean by that? In other words, they negotiated me down. So the idea here is that there's something about Jews that means that they're tough negotiators in certain situations. Often, again, used stereotypically, but sometimes often quite correct as well. Number 6, why are Jews often aggressive and argumentative? This is really funny. I do, of course, a lot of, because I'm a rabbi, I do a lot of marriages, and a lot of marriages I do are interfaith, Jews and non-Jews. And so a lot of times you get a Jewish believer, a Messianic Jew, marrying a Gentile Christian girl. And the Gentile Christian, in this case, we'll say a girl, and the guy is the man. The guy is the Jew, sorry. And so what will happen is the girl's real sweet, Gentile Christian background, real nice, and the Jewish guy is kind of tough and argumentative and stuff like that. And so the girl's always trying to get the guy to change because he's, doesn't, quote, reflect the character of Jesus. And so because he's kind of argumentative and aggressive and so forth. Well, part of it is the experience of the Jewish people. It doesn't, honestly, I don't think the aggressiveness and argumentativeness is necessarily a bad thing. It can be bad, but it doesn't necessarily mean it is bad. It's just somewhat of a cultural experience that they have developed throughout the centuries because of what they've been through. And we will definitely cover that as well. Number 7, why do most Jews have good families? In other words, why is the family structure among the Jewish people so strong? Now, in the modern generation, this really, I guess we would say my generation that grew up in the 1960s and 70s, and then the most recent generation, which I think are called the millennials, if I'm not mistaken, is some of that's breaking down. But certainly historically, the Jewish community has had very strong families, and we'll look at that question. Number 8 is, why often are the closest friends of Jews other Jews? Now, this doesn't mean that Jews don't have Christian friends or non-Jewish friends, but typically, Jewish communities tend to live together. In other words, wherever you are in the world, there's probably an area where most of the Jews live together, and their closest friends tend to be the Jewish people. Why is that the case? We will look at that question. Number 9, why are Jews tend to be so resistant to the gospel? Now, this is going to be a huge issue, which we will definitely cover as we get through this course, but that is clearly the case, and I think you will be surprised by the answer to that question. And finally, is why do the Jewish people tend to be politically liberal? In other words, for instance, in the most recent presidential election, President Obama garnered about 81% of the Jewish vote in America, despite the fact that his credentials vis-a-vis the nation of Israel were quite questionable. In other words, people questioned, they really wondered, was he going to be a supporter of Israel? Certainly not at the level of George Bush. And yet, the vast majority, 80% or more of the Jewish community still voted for President Obama. Why is that the case? We're going to look at that question as well. These are the 10 questions that we're going to be examining in this course. Now, I'm not going to be saying, when here we are, here's answer to number 1, blah, 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 but the course itself will answer these questions, because the goal of this course is, as the believing community, we want to be able to understand the Jewish people, to relate with them, to understand their experiences, and so that ultimately, when we share about Yeshua being the Messiah, we're not coming in as outsiders, but we're trying to welcome them in, that it's the most normal thing for the Jewish people to believe in their own Messiah. But if you don't understand them, if you don't understand their experience, then when you share these words with them, the words about Yeshua, it will seem foreign and against what they should believe. But as we embrace the history of the Jewish people and you relate to them, you can understand what it's all about, and then be able to present Yeshua in a more palatable way so that they will also acknowledge really who he is. All right. We want to turn to the scriptures right now, and we want to begin to look at the origins, ultimately, of the Jewish people and of all the nations of the earth. So I want to turn your attention to the book of Genesis, and we're going to look at Genesis chapter 9, and beginning in verse 26, with Noah and his sons. Now remember, of course, we've just come through the flood, and so Noah has 3 sons. They're the only people that survive. And these 3 sons become the father of the nations, as outlined in Genesis chapter 10. According to the rabbis, in Genesis 10, God establishes 70 nations that cover the entire earth. And among these nations, or these late nations, are ultimately come from Noah's sons. So we're going to begin in Genesis 9, verse 26, and this is what it said. He also said, this is talking about Noah now, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, may Canaan be the slave of Shem." Now, if you're looking at an English Bible, you will see that the word Lord is actually capitalized. Capital letters, L-O-R-D, are all capitalized. In other Bibles, maybe around the world, I don't know exactly what it would look like, but this word Lord would be highlighted in some way. The word Lord here that you see is actually not the word Lord in Hebrew. The word Lord in Hebrew is the word Adon. But the word here is actually the name of God. The name of God in Hebrew is Yud He Vav He. This is known as the Tetragrammaton, or the non-pronounceable name of God. Jews are not allowed to pronounce that name. And so what they do is instead of is that they take that name, and instead of kind of transliterating it on the page, they simply designate his name as the Lord. It's often like when you read in the Hebrew and you see the Lord's name, you say Adonai, which means the Lord or my Lord. So a typical Hebrew prayer would be Baruch Atah Adonai, blessed are you, O Lord. And the word Adonai is the word Lord, but the Hebrew doesn't really say that. You're always supposed to say that and repeat. Now, why am I saying this? Because it says this here. It says, "Blessed be the Lord." This is God's name. The name that God is going to be known throughout all of the scriptures is the God of Shem. Now, it's interesting here because Noah has 3 sons, but only Shem is designated as being the one whom the Lord is over. And so what happens here is among Noah's sons, all 3 of his sons become the father of all these different nations, but it's Shem who is going to carry a special lineage, a special covenant from God that is going to go down among the nations. With this, I want to turn to our maps here. I'm going to have maps throughout this course, and in your packet, each of you are going to have a packet, and in that packet will be multiple maps. And this, now the maps that you have and the ones that I have, we're going to be a little bit different, but they'll tend to be somewhat similar. But up here on the board, what you'll see on your screen right now, are the maps of the ancient peoples of the world. And if you'll see here the green, which is in the kind of in the Middle East, those are the descendants of Shem. The descendants of Shem are the Semites. And we've all heard about Semites. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. But they are the descendants of Shem, and the Jewish people are one of the best known of the Semitic groups. I wonder if you would know who another very well-known Semitic group is. If you're thinking Arabs, you just got it, because the Arab people are also Semites. They are cousins of the Jewish people. They are descendants of Ishmael, because Ishmael was actually the first son of Abraham, and he becomes the father of the Arab people. They are Semites, and then as well, you have the Jewish people, also Semites as well. Now, if we'll turn to Genesis chapter 10. If you look in verse 2, you'll see the sons of Japheth. It says Gomer, Magog, Madai, Yavin, and so on. These individuals are really the father. Japheth is the father, or Japhet is the father of the Indo-European groups. And so the Indo-Europeans are the pink area up here on the map, like essentially the area of Europe. Also, they happen to be the father, of the Indian people. So that's the second major category of people groups. And the final category is the group known as Ham or Ham, which is in verse 6. It says the sons of Ham are Cush, Mitzrayim, Put, and Canaan. And Ham is the father of the African people, this blue group right here.